Thank you very much, Chair. Professor Moloko has convinced me that we should present from here, so we will present from here. All protocol observed. Let me start by saying that I will approach the presentation from three perspectives. The first, I sit on the Provincial Social Cohesion Committee, which was established last year, headed by Professor Paulo Zulu, one of our leading sociologists, and we've just completed our report, which will be presented in a week's time to the Cabinet here. The second, the Premier spoke about earlier on. Following the incidents, he established a committee on migration and community integration, and that committee is currently sitting, and we've taken evidence from a number of communities, and we continue to take evidence from communities around this particular issue. And in about 3 months' time, we will have finalized our report, which we will present to the Provincial Cabinet. So those are two initiatives. And the third perspective is from the Accord perspective, where we have been working on the continent for the last 23 years in conflict situations. And I think that that's pertinent to the issues that we're dealing with related to migration and the challenges that we face around that. So let me start by indicating three things. The first, I think the Honorable Speaker indicated that this is a global problem. And this is not a South African problem, this is not a SADC problem, this is not an African problem, this is a global problem. The second issue is what the Premier alluded to, is the fact that this is not something that will end today. This is a problem that will recur on a continuous basis, and what we have to do is be prepared to mitigate this particular issue. And the third then is there are 3 points that I would like to raise in connection with the issue of building capable states and governance frameworks. The first is that we are in an era of what I call convergence and complexity. And let me explain what that means. There are a number of factors that are coming to the fore in an unprecedented manner at this particular juncture in history. And they are going to challenge us in very many ways and bring huge complexity that we have to deal with. The first is unprecedented population growth at an exponential rate. So if you take the SADC region, for example, we were in 1990, 166 million people. Today, we are 300 million people. In 2035, we will be around 460 million people. The DRC itself, 110 million people. Tanzania, 90 million people. South Africa, close to 60 million people. So that's the first phenomenon. The second is rapid urbanization. We were 31% urbanized in 1990, 41% urbanized today, and in 2035, close to 50% urbanized. The third is climate change. You are currently sitting in a region that is water stressed. We are experiencing a drought currently in this particular locality that you sit in, and Southern Africa is in a water-stressed region. So those are a number of factors that are coming together. The discussion that we are having here at the SADC Parliamentary Forum on industrialization is extremely pertinent to the challenges that we face and how we will deal with those challenges. Because you cannot get exponential growth of populations and rapid urbanization without the creation of another economy. We have an agricultural economy, but we're rapidly urbanizing without the creation of an industrial economy. Those who say we can leapfrog into the information economy, we are not going to be able to do that, because that requires a different skill set, and we are not even near that skill set yet. But the industrial economy can absorb people at a low skill level, and that's where our solutions would lie. Now, unless we're able to do that, we're going to see a rapidly urbanizing center all throughout the SADC region without the prospect of any employment, with growing inequality and growing poverty. There are going to be push factors and pull factors. Inevitably, there will be pull factors into South Africa, and there will be push factors from the other countries in the region. So this is a reality that we have to deal with, and I think the Minister has quite correctly pointed out that what we witnessed in the SADC region and in KwaZulu-Natal particularly was the class nature of that migration. So if you look at what we were dealing with, and in our consultations with the various communities, we met with Somali business people, we met with Ethiopian business people, and we met with South African business people. And this was essentially not just an Afrophobic attack. That's how it was portrayed. This was a clash amongst tuck shop owners for scarce resources. That's what it was. South African tuck shop owners just couldn't compete with their much better endowed, because these were economic refugees, they came with capital, but they also came with a trading culture. Somalis and Ethiopians have a very strong trading culture, and South African businesses just couldn't compete with that trading culture. It was that clash that initially started off this particular problem. Of course, in any country in the world, whether you have this in the United States, as we've seen in New York a couple of years ago when they had their hurricane, that when you have such problems, people loot shops. So here we had the same thing. Once these attacks took place between the different business people, and let me just give you the statistics. The Ethiopians tell us they control 600 tuck shops in this area only. The Somalis around 350 tuck shops. This is not statistics that we got, these are statistics that they gave us, and they're quite well organized as well. South Africans around 350 tuck shops. So this was essentially a clash amongst people, business people. Then, of course, criminal elements took over, they looted these shops, and then it took a life of its own. And we were very lucky to have stemmed this in a very, very short period of time. That brings us now to the second point. We then have to look at domestic legislation. Now, whilst I agree with Professor Olukushi that yes, we should have free movement, no laws, no regulations, in the context in which we are operating, it's not possible. When we are sitting with an average of 35% unemployment in South Africa, aggregating at about 50% in this province, it's not possible for us to just have an unregulated migration into the province. It will create huge problems for us to deal with. Apart from the unemployment, we are also dealing with huge inequality in the country. And we have realized now, 20 years later, that it was not possible to deal with poverty, unemployment, and inequality, which are deeply structural, in just 20 years. It's going to take us another generation or 2 generations to deal with those particular problems. There are very complex problems structurally, and they require very complex solutions, and they require time to resolve. In the meanwhile, those numbers on poverty, unemployment, and inequality will continue to grow as populations grow exponentially. If we don't industrialize fast enough, not just in South Africa, but in the SADC region, if we don't have an industrial policy and the implementation of that industrial policy where we create centers of employment, where we begin to deal with inequality, and where we approach poverty in a way that we create livelihoods for people, we're not going to be able to deal with this problem of migration. So we have to mitigate in the meanwhile. How do we mitigate in the meantime? Well, we have to mitigate by ensuring that not just yourselves as legislators put the laws in place, because that's the first part. And as a lawyer, I can tell you that's probably the easiest part to do. Is the implementation of the laws that you craft that's the more difficult place to work with. And we have been working with our Ministry of Home Affairs here, trying to understand what are the problems in implementation. And I can tell you it's partly a problem of skill levels, it's partly a problem of capacity, and it is largely a problem of being completely overrun by the numbers. The numbers of people at the borders is just extremely difficult to deal with that in a meaningful way that gives people, particularly refugees, whether economic or political, the kind of respect that we would like to give them as a country and a nation. The second issue, I think, related to how South Africa dealt with the problem of migration. Under President Mandela's government, we took a conscious decision not to put people as political refugees or economic refugees into camps, but to integrate them into communities. We did it with all the altruism that we had without understanding the consequences of that. And the consequences for our own domestic context, but also the consequences that we would have to later deal with in terms of the backlash that comes from the region and the continent. Lastly, then, in terms of the regional context, yourselves as the SADC Parliamentary Forum, you have to ensure that you have the harmonization of legislation in the region. There can't be different legislation for a region that we are trying to economically integrate, politically unite, and socially ensure that there's mobility around the region. We can't do it without the harmonization. Visa requirements, border control, all of those things have to be harmonized. And then, of course, finally, the protocol on the facilitation of the movement of people, which requires the ratification by all countries. Those of you who are sitting here today representing your countries need to ensure that we go back with that and ensure that all of our countries would ratify it. So I think that, firstly, we have to deal with the context of convergence and complexity. We have to deal with the domestic legislation, and we have to deal with the harmonization of regional legislation. If we do all of those things, we stand a fighting chance, because time is against us. We stand a fighting chance with at least mitigating and managing the problem. We will not resolve the problem in the short term. Thank you very much.